to call the meeting to order. Get started. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our July 2013.
We're not hearing you.
Marvin, can you hear me now?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I just said I want to welcome everybody to our July meeting. And I'm going to open up by saying that we received a letter earlier this month from Pat Bulgaro.
Dan, your voice is dropping again. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Maybe somebody could move the microphone a little closer. Thank you. What I was saying was I wanted to thank Commissioner Bulgaro, who resigned effective July 30th from the commission. We want to thank him for his service and wish him well. The first order of business this morning is our minutes from our meeting of July 25th. And I'd ask for a motion to adopt those minutes.
So moved. Sure.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none, the minutes are approved. I'd like to now turn to our Chief of Staff, Monica Stamm, who will give us an update beginning with the roundtable discussions with the regulated community.
Thank you. As we mentioned at the last meeting, we've been continuing to hold these roundtable discussions with lobbyists, clients, as well as state officers and employees. And we held our last one on June 28th on the subject, and the subject was the random audit program under the lobbying law. It was a very productive discussion, and we hope to continue to have these roundtable discussions as we've been doing them. We announce them as a few weeks in advance via our website and e-blasts, and we anticipate that we will continue this program. And again, if anyone has ideas, we're open to suggestions, but we have various topics planned in the coming months. Next on the agenda is an update on the annual financial disclosure statements, and as we expressed at the last meeting, we've now received the filings from the legislature, and the financial disclosure statements from the elected members have been posted on JCOP's website for the first time. Overall, we've received approximately 22,000 financial disclosure statements, which we have and we're processing. The next item on the agenda is the first quarter financial report, and I'm going to turn it over to Director of Administration, Janine Clemente.
Yes, for the first quarter of 2013-14, we spent approximately 20% of our cash allowance for the year. We spent $726,308 on personal services and $158,238 on non-personal services for a total of $884,546.
Anybody have any questions for Janine?
Janine, where are we in terms of the budget on our expenditures against the appropriation and the cash plan?
I'm sorry?
Where are we in terms of our budget?
Mm-hmm. We're at approximately 20%. Is that
20%,
right?
yes, I'm sorry.
Okay. Thank you, Janine. We are now going to get an update on our pending regulations. And again, I'd ask Monica to give us an update on where those stand.
Sure. First, I'll mention the public service announcement regulations. As we discussed at the last meeting, staff has been working with the community on draft regulations, and we posted those draft regulations on the Commission's website to begin an informal public comment process. We are currently accepting public comments. We will accept them through August 16th and then continue to incorporate what we hear in the comments into the regulations before we present them to the Commission for adoption of proposed rulemaking to go through the SAFA process. The gift regulations, or it's gift and related regulations, there were 4 sets of regulations the Commission adopted. Those will be published in the State Register on August 14th. So that will begin public comment period, a 45-day public comment period, which will end on September 28th. And then we anticipate that, depending on those comments, we will present them to the commission after that. We will also post those on our website and send an e-blast out when those are available in the state register. That brings us to the source of funding regulations, which are attached to your books at tab B. These are the final version of the source of funding regulations, which the commission have adopted. I'll just remind the commission that in June of 2012, we had a public hearing to begin an informal process on these source of funding regulations. The regulations were then adopted in July of 2012, and we began the public comment process under the State Administrative Procedure Act. We've gone through several rounds of comments and adoptions. The commission adopted this version of the regs in April of 2013. They were published, and there was a public comment period which ended earlier this month. We did not receive any comments on the last version of these regs, so they are ready to become final, and they will become final and effective when they are published in the state register, which we anticipate would be August 14th. As I just remind everyone, they currently are in effect as emergency regulations, and we've gone through 2 filing periods where these were in effect: the January filing and the July.
Monica, just to be clear, we haven't made any changes since April, is that correct?
Right. There were changes that were made in April. The commission adopted them. And again, we had a comment period. There were no comments.
Right,
So
okay.
they are final, and no further commission action would be required. They will just be published in the state register, and when they're published, they become effective.
If I could, I'd like to speak briefly on it. And I know I contacted the chair, and I think there's some other individuals that might have some input on it or thought on it. It seems to me with some of these blanket exemptions, we're making a mistake with the way we're proceeding from a policy standpoint. Certainly transparency with our organization is what we're here for. What we're talking about is allowing a special interest, in essence, to present this information but not have a public debate about it. I don't see any harm, quite frankly, with this body reviewing these applications, talking about the issues of law, talking about public information, and making our determinations in the applications of those issues of law in open. I think it would add to transparency. I think we've maybe made a mistake or two along the way, and it's a new organization. And I think I'm big enough to say, I didn't see it early enough, and I think maybe other people agree with me. But I do think it's an opportunity now to talk about allowing some of these blanket exemptions, that really what we're talking about is potentially tens of millions of dollars to be exempted from review. We should have that debate publicly. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on it.
Can we just get I'm happy to have the discussion.
Sure.
Certainly think that your discussion and allusion to the need for transparency is one I think that we all share. It's very, very important. Certainly it's the underpinning of our statute and what we strive for. But I'd like the staff to just talk about the parameters of the statute, which if we're guided by, then I think we should absolutely have a discussion about this.
Sure, I'm happy to start the discussion, and then Rob Cohen should jump in wherever you want. But as you're referring to is the process that the statute creates, so just so everyone understands, the statute creates this exemption from the disclosure requirements. It's in the lobbying law in 2 different provisions, and it creates an exemption for certain 501c4 organizations if they meet certain criteria. The statute then gives the commission discretion to do regulations to implement the exemption process. And the regulations this is part of the regulations which I was just discussing, which we've been working on for the past year. In the exemption process, the language that's in effect as we speak is that the application process is confidential, but the commission has the discretion to make the fact of the application public. So
Okay.
that's the state of the law right now. Now, the policy reasons for that was to come up with a balancing of the need for transparency, which, as you've expressed, Commissioner Renzi, that the public should know about the application process and that there has been an application, whether the commission grants it or not. You have to balance that with the purpose of the exemption, which is to protect individuals who are affiliated with these 501c4 organizations that there's a reasonable probability that they will be subject to a harm, threat, some kind of personal ramification for their affiliation with these organizations based on the fact that these organizations have experienced that with their.
Oh, and I'm not, and I don't challenge that. My only point is, I'm talking about issues of law. We can debate that. I'm not looking for donor lists now. I'm looking at what are those dangers that people are concerned about, and let's talk about the generalities of those. It's not privileged information, it's public information. And I'm just looking in a general way to have an open, that's all.
May I add to Commissioner Renzi? I think where the focus is 938.8 of the regulations regarding the confidentiality of exemption-related materials. And my first question to staff or anybody else is, where in the statute, where in PURA is there a requirement, where does one exist, that we must keep all this information confidential? Is there a statutory mandate?
The short answer is no, there's not a statutory mandate. The commission is authorized by statute to adopt regulations as it sees fit, but there's no statutory mandate to keep these materials confidential. Again, as Monica said, the provision,
Can you speak up, Rob?
the provision mandating confidentiality in the regulations was motivated by the underlying purpose of the exemption, and the idea, the thinking behind the keeping the application materials confidential was that if it were otherwise, if the materials were to be made publicly available, it might have a chilling effect on applicants, which would undermine the very purpose of the statutory exemption.
But Rob, I mean, isn't there something where Commissioner Renzi's going, which would be called the middle ground? I mean, a lot of the information that we receive in these applications is already in the public domain. I mean, there's nothing that precluded us from using maybe a broader perspective and giving ourselves the authorization to sort out, either with or without the applicant, that information which we were given, which should remain confidential, which we do not want people to suffer any harm, and that information that could support an application that should be released to the public so people will have an understanding as to how we do our business. I mean, that's what transparency and accountability call for.
I don't have any argument with you that there is no statutory provision mandating that these materials be confidential. It's within the Commission's discretion to adopt regulations that provide for that.
And I'm going to be the second one to admit that I missed this when we went through it.
Well, I mean, I guess. Go ahead, Al.
I suppose that we all missed it. It seems to me, based upon the filings that we have, I can't imagine any of these organizations wanting to keep this confidential because, as George points out, most of it's in the public domain. I do think, however, there may be circumstances where an individual organization can make a reasonable request to keep some of the information confidential, and that we should honor that. So perhaps we could amend this part of our regulation to say, shall, upon reasonable request from the party, keep it confidential. But in general, it ought to be open to the public.
Well, let me just ask the staff, because we have heard that the regulations are essentially, these regulations have been fully vetted and gone through the SAPA process, and are essentially a signature away from becoming final regs. It would seem to me that if there is a desire and a consensus among the commissioners to talk about an amendment to the regs, that is something that we should do. it would be my view that we should go ahead with the current regulations, because we're talking about the source of funding regs, and we're not just talking about the exemption here. What's on the cusp of becoming finalized are, a year and a half worth of regulatory process for our source of funding regs. And I don't know what the commissioners feel about moving forward and then having a discussion about whether we want to begin a process to amend those regulations.
Am I mistaken that they are already currently operative as an emergency regulation? So isn't that already the case?
It is, but I'll let the staff explain.
You basically have about a year from when you start the formal rulemaking process under SAPA to finalize the regs. So the emergency regs will be in effect during that period of time, but that period of time may expire before we...
When does it expire?
I believe it would expire when they were first published, which I think was in September. Yeah, so I think the very beginning of September, because we adopted them for the first time at the end of July. And then there's paperwork that has to be done before they're published, and then there's like a 2-week lag after you submit them. So we have very little time left to finalize these regs. Then the emergency regs will cease, and the community really won't know how to proceed. And some of it is just on. I mean, so as the chair said, this is about the source of funding regs as a whole, not just the one piece with the exemptions.
But if you could enact them and then do an amendment to this particular 93.8 provision?
Exactly, and that's what I was sort of throwing out for discussion, that we let these current regs, which again go well beyond the issue of exemptions and are the product of a year and a half worth of work, and I believe the regulated community is awaiting these regs to be finally published. And I also hear there are a number of commissioners who want to visit this issue about an amendment. So I don't know what the consensus is.
Let me ask a question. Procedurally, is there anything that precludes us from moving forward today, having these finalized the on an emergency basis, adopting an amendment to this particular provision?
So you mean letting the current version be finalized and then beginning a new parallel proceeding that would go into effect on an emergency basis?
I'm going to defer to the staff. My understanding was that we are only permitted to issue emergency regulations once, and that's our bite at the apple. And we've had our bite at the apple. And so that's why I'm suggesting that we let these regs go into effect and we begin a process by which we amend the regulations, following the statute, following the appropriate process. Commissioner Levine?
Well, first of all, Mr. Chairman, I want to state that I'm in total accord with the observations made by Commissioner Renzi. And while we're at it, I'd like to reiterate the view that I expressed previously, that there ought to be a separate amendment to the regs, whereby we would require entities that are granted an exemption to file with us the list of the donors that they have, and the list would be maintained in confidence by us. And given the fact there's at least 2 potential amendments to the regs, I also agree with you. We ought to proceed with the regulation in chief and then expeditiously proceed with a discussion about amending.
I agree with Commissioner Levine. My concern would be potentially tabling the exemptions until that can occur.
Well, to the extent that we're going to be asked to consider exemptions, those exemptions can be considered, and the commissioners can consider them, and we'll make the appropriate disclosures about.
But I don't want to have it. Yeah,
if you do that,
that's counterproductive
then you
to the whole point here.
Right. I'm sorry, I didn't mean
No,
to cut
please,
you off.
I understand.
But that, to me, if the commission, and I don't know where we're all going to fall, But if the commission feels strongly that there should at least be some disclosure and that not all material needs to be maintained as confidential, that to the extent that we are presented with any exemptions, that they should be tabled until that's resolved.
Yeah,
Otherwise, you can't unring that bell.
No, I understand that. That makes, I mean, I think that's a, I mean, if that's what the commission feels it ought to do, that's prudent. Okay, so, I mean,
I think, Mr. Chairman, there's obviously a consensus. We need to revisit the subject of exemption.
You can table anything you want to.
Conversation here today, I think it is a subject that should be handed to perhaps the administrative committee to take a good look at and come back at our next meeting with something for the entire board to consider. And to do it in a way that preliminarily to the meeting, there is a distribution of some kind of a confidential report with regard to how we might treat the subject of exemption in terms of amendment by the total commission.
yeah, I mean, I think that's an excellent point, and I for one, would like to hear from staff on this and give them an opportunity to think about some of the ideas that the commissioners have proposed as a way of accommodating this important desire for transparency and the balancing that we're talking about. So what I would propose is that we go ahead and finalize the regulations, and I think that you should get a report from staff, and we can put this issue on the agenda for our next meeting. I think that to the extent that if there is a consensus that we defer any pending applications for exemptions, that we do that as we sort out the more fundamental issue of how we want to address exemptions generally.
I'd ask that, I want to say that I hope that we also consider Commissioner Levine's concern regarding the filing of the information with us versus the public disclosure, so that doesn't get lost.
No. And when I said that I want the staff, and I think I understood Commissioner DiOrio to be talking about having the staff and the admin committee take a look at these issues legally and do an analysis of what's possible and give us some options to accommodate what commissioners are expressing today.
Well, let me make a recommendation to staff that a good place to start might be in the Freedom of Information Law. There is a provision on release of material from somebody who has provided information to a governmental entity, and there's a FOIL request for that, and then there's a process where they go back to the person who provided it. And one of the exemptions within that is that if release of the information would in fact defeat the purpose of trying to keep it confidential, then you should keep it confidential.
Sure. You don't want the tail wagging the dog. The exemptions form, absolutely.
I believe there is case law.
That point is very well taken, and also I think we have an obligation to go back and revisit the legislative history here and determine as best we can what the intention of the legislature is. I agree. Exactly. In order to react to it in an appropriate fashion.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Commissioner Jacobs.
We're being called upon today to vote to finalize. That's a vote.
Actually, can I just interject? There is no vote today. We've already voted. Commission action is complete. The only thing that needs to be done is an administrative act of the chair signing the final referral for publication in the state register. That's it. Our action has been completed.
Okay, I wanted to clarify that, number one. Now, if the chair does not finalize today by signature, but awaits finalization for the meeting of August 30th, when we can gather in all of this other information that is supposed to come by reason of staff review and study and the admin committee's review and study. Because aren't we as commissioners, and you are representative of the commission, you're the chair. If you sign this at a point when all of this uncertainty is out there. Is that not unwise? I just don't see how we go forward on the source of funding regulations with all of these open issues that have been raised here today.
Well, I'd love to accommodate you, Commissioner Jacobs, but there are two issues about deferring the implementation of the regs until August. Number one, the practical issue, which is, as we talked about at our last meeting, we're not having a meeting in August, and there is also a statutory 40-day comment period on any regulatory amendments. So what my understanding is that we would not be able to actually amend the regulations within the proper statutory period, which is why I was suggesting that, and it appeared that there was a consensus to do this, that we go ahead, finalize these regulations, work through the proper process, both legally and the process we've set up within the Commission to address these matters, and I can assure you that these issues will be fully vetted by the staff. I think Commissioner Weissman, as he always does, has given the staff some good legal marrow to chew on with the Freedom of Information Act. So I think we're really well positioned at this point to move forward, finalize these regulations, which the regulated community has been anxiously awaiting, I think, for a year and a half, and we'll move forward. And that's what I think we should do. And unless there's a motion, I think we can, or any further discussion on this?
Well, do we need to table it formally, the exemptions? I mean, I'd like to table any exemptions until we're able to move forward on the amendment. Other than that, I'm in agreement.
Don't we do that when they're before us? Because they're not really before us.
Well, I don't
In this
know.
moment.
I'd like to have it discussed now.
They will be. In this.
I'd make a formal motion to table the exemptions currently before us, if that would be helpful.
I'll second that motion.
Do we want to have any discussion about that?
Well, if we're going to revisit the subject of exemptions, we need to have our position finalized with regard to how we're going to treat with the exemptions. And perhaps from a procedural point of view as well as a substantive point of view, it is smart to defer any decision-making on exemptions while we are considering the revisiting of the subject to come up with a policy and a program on a go-forward basis.
Yeah, I mean, Commissioner Yarashevsky, I mean, I'm happy to entertain the motion. I mean, I think it's up to us. We have within our discretion whether or not we actually want to entertain these, and whether we do it formally or informally. You know, I'm not sure that really matters. In other words, we've been asked to consider certain exemptions, and we can wait to do that, or we can do it by motion. Commissioner Johnson?
I certainly have no objection to doing it by motion or otherwise. I just, to the extent that any of these entities are running up on a filing date, I'm assuming that we would grant them an extension with respect to their filing, because otherwise they would end up in a catch-22 themselves, right?
The filing date was July 15th, and so they timely filed their exemption application. So to the extent that we...
So they don't have to do anything else until we act on it?
Starts when we act.
Yeah, okay. All right.
I think it would be helpful to do it formally, just so that we have a clear record. And I think that Commissioner DiOrio's statement, I'm happy to amend the vote, the motion in accordance with what he indicated.
Okay, can you just, for the sake of clarity, then restate your motion, Commissioner?
Maybe, Commissioner, I'm going to defer to you, Commissioner DiOrio, because I think you suggested we defer it, which might be a better formal motion.
Well, the deference to the consideration of what exists in terms of applications is by itself something that really doesn't need a motion, as I understand it. I mean, this is just a procedural matter at this point. If we are not going to consider the reconsideration of our position on exemptions, then it seems to me a fortiori. You don't proceed with considering exemptions. I don't know if that needs a motion. I think a ruling of the chair would be fine. And I'm glad to support the ruling of the chair.
Yeah, I mean, I think I made it clear. Again, I'm agnostic. I happen to think that we have the authority without a vote simply to defer consideration, as we defer consideration on any matters that come before us. But, you know, if you want to be belts and suspenders, you know, we have a motion on the table. I mean, I'm happy.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm going to leave the motion on the table. I just think for the public it's really important that we're very clear about what we're doing. So I leave the motion on the table, which just says that we are going to defer consideration of the current request until such time as we reconsider 938.8.
Okay, there's a motion on the table. Any further discussion?
You seconded it.
Is there a second?
I seconded it previously.
We had a second. All in favor? Can you see a show of hands, please?
Aye.
Any opposed? I see no hands. The motion is carried unanimously. Okay. Unless, is there a motion? Commissioner Cavello.
What's so funny?
I said that concludes the meeting.
Is
Just
there-
joking, we have a lot more work.
Is there a motion? I think we've completed
To-
the agenda for the public portion of our meeting.
I'll move.
Is there a motion to enter into executive session?
So moved.
Second?
Aye. Oh, second.
All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Seeing none, the motion is carried. This concludes this portion of the public session of our meeting today, and we're going to go into executive session. Thank you very much. Okay, we're back in public session. During our executive session, we considered applications for exemptions from the requirements of 8B, the revolving door requirements, and we discussed a number of investigative matters
Public session.
during our executive session. Unless there's any other business before the commission, is there a motion to adjourn our meeting?
So,
Second?
second.
All in favor? Any opposed? I see none, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much.